3 years ago, I made a response to a video produced by PragerU titled, "Was the Civil War Really About Slavery?" Their video was extremely flawed, containing multiple claims that are outright false, as well as many claims that, while true, are misleading. But my response was also flawed. It was one of my first videos, and I've outgrown a few of the amateurish mistakes I made then. Today I am endeavoring to do justice to this 2015 PragerU video by producing a more comprehensive rebuttal. The gentleman speaking in the video is Cedermark, the former head of the history department at West Point, and a man well known for his anti-Confederate stances. His purpose is to persuade the viewer that the American Civil War was exclusively fought due to slavery, which is a valid viewpoint, even if it lacks important nuance. His argumentation, however, leaves much to be desired, and it is my belief that, after you watch his response, you will be thoroughly convinced that this video is a transparent and poorly made piece of historical revisionist propaganda.
Was the American Civil War fought because of slavery? More than 150 years later, this remains a controversial question. Why? Because many people don't want to believe that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution. There has to be another reason, we are told. Well, there isn't. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Slavery was, by a wide margin, the single most important cause of the Civil War, for both sides. Before the presidential election of 1860, a South Carolina newspaper warned that the issue before the country was the extinction of slavery, and called on all who were not prepared to surrender the institution to act. Shortly after Abraham Lincoln's victory, they did.
In the first 30 seconds of the video, we encounter Cedermark's first point, and it's nothing more than a blanket statement regarding the motivations of the Confederates. Notice the argument being made here is not that the Confederacy, as a country, was fighting to maintain slavery, but rather that Confederate soldiers and civilians were fighting and dying to protect the institution of slavery. Given that Cedermark explicitly states
that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution,
there is no way to interpret his blanket statement but to mean that rank-and-file Confederate soldiers were, in general, personally motivated to protect slavery. This is completely untrue. Even without presenting any evidence, logic and critical thinking will tell you that the average person wasn't motivated by slavery. Some people certainly were, but to claim that each and every Confederate soldier, or even just the majority of Confederate soldiers, served in the Army because they wanted to protect slavery, and only because they wanted to protect slavery, stretches well past the bounds of credulity. Considering the fact that many men on both sides were conscripted and had no say in joining the fight, and that the majority of Confederate soldiers didn't even own any slaves, it seems unlikely that very many of them would be motivated to defend the institution of slavery. Fortunately, there is no need for this to remain theoretical, because we have writings from many Confederate soldiers and officers explaining in their own words and from their own perspective why they fought. Consider the memoir of Corporal Samuel R. Watkins, Company Aytch, one of the most popular Civil War memoirs ever written. In the first few pages, Watkins states the following, quote, "Secession may have been wrong in the abstract, and has been tried and settled by the arbitrament of the sword and bayonet, but I am as firm in my conviction today of the right of secession as I was in 1861. The South is our country, the North is the country of those who live there. We are an agricultural people, they are a manufacturing people. They are the descendants of the good old Puritan Plymouth Rock stock, and we of the South from the proud and aristocratic stock of the Cavaliers. We believe in the doctrine of states' rights, they in the doctrine of centralization. The South fell battling under the banner of states' rights, yet still grand and glorious even in death." End quote. Consider this excerpt of a letter from the Gray Ghost of the Confederacy, Colonel John S. Mosby, sent to a Mr. Samuel Chapman in 1907, quote, "Now, while I think as badly of slavery as Horace Greeley did, I am not ashamed that my family were slaveholders. It was our inheritance. Neither am I ashamed that my ancestors were pirates and cattle thieves. People must be judged by the standard of their own age. If it was right to own slaves as property, it was right to fight for it. The South went to war on account of slavery. South Carolina went to war, as she said in her secession proclamation, because slavery would not be secure under Lincoln. South Carolina ought to know what was the cause for her seceding. I am not ashamed of having fought on the side of slavery. A soldier fights for his country, right or wrong. He is not responsible for the political merits of the course he fights in. The South was my country." End quote. Consider this audio clip of an interview by Private Julius Howell.
Then came up the great struggle when the Republican Party had become a power in the land. In 1860, Mr. Lincoln was elected, as you know. And I remember that there was a good deal of excitement in my section that the Negro slavery would be interfered with. Niggers would be set free and all that. Well, I didn't feel much interest about it because I felt kindly toward the dockers, and they were kindly toward me and toward my family. But my neighbors around there, some of them who were over 45, kinsmen of mine, some of them, began to just get up a company of cavalry. And I, a boy of 16 and a half years old, joined the cavalry company, which afterwards was attached and counted with others among the 24th Virginia Cavalry. That as a young man that way, I couldn't understand it fully. But I look back now and see my part in it and saw what we struggled for, and that was for states' rights. For states' rights. And as many of you know, immediately after the war, the rights of the various states, well, especially in the South, were very much curtailed, if I may use that word.
Those are just a few examples, but there are many others. Almost universally, Confederate soldiers fought because they were serving their country. Some fought for slavery, of course, but they were the exception rather than the rule. The most damning of these specific examples is the letter written by John Mosby, who clearly believes that the war was fought due to slavery, yet still claims that he personally was not fighting for slavery. As for ordinary rank-and-file Union soldiers, many actually were fighting to end slavery, especially late in the war, but this was still not universal, and many didn't care or even pro-slavery. On the whole, Sedgley has no way to back up this claim whatsoever.
The secession documents of every Southern state made clear, crystal clear, that they were leaving the Union in order to protect their peculiar institution of slavery, a phrase that at the time meant the thing special to them.
As his next point, Sedgley has claimed that every Southern state made clear in their secession documents that they were seceding primarily to protect slavery. It's impossible for this to be the case because not every state even gave the reasons for their secession at all. Of the states which did give official causes, some states did claim to secede in order to defend slavery, but some claimed to secede for other reasons. Of the initial 7 states to secede, the secession documents of South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia do in fact claim that their state seceded to protect slavery. Alabama also implies that slavery is the reason, but never says so explicitly. But Florida and Louisiana both gave no reason why they were seceding. They simply gave an official declaration that they were withdrawing from the Union. These 7 states were the first wave to secede, but another wave came later, consisting of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So, what did those states say about why they were seceding? North Carolina and Tennessee both gave no reason why they were seceding. Virginia claims to have been seceding due to the, quote, injury to the people of Virginia, and the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. As for what that means, you could construe that as Virginia wishing to protect slavery, and that the oppression of the slaveholding states was describing the restriction of slavery. You could also construe it to be referring to the impending military conflict between the United States and the fledgling Confederate States. It was actually President Lincoln's call on April 15, 1861, to mobilize 75,000 militia from these 4 states that induced them to secede and join the Confederacy. It's unclear which is the more correct interpretation, and it's not out of the question that both of those could be the intended meanings simultaneously. Personally, I believe the interpretation that Virginia was unwilling to fight other southern states, which the Virginians likely sympathized with from the beginning, is the correct one. As for Arkansas, there is no ambiguity. They explicitly claim they seceded because they refused to fight other southern states. Quote, whereas, in addition to the well-founded causes of complaint set forth by this convention, and resolutions adopted on the 11th of March, AD 1861, against the sectional party now in power in Washington City. Headed by Abraham Lincoln, he has, in the face of resolutions passed by this convention, pledging the state of Arkansas to resist to the last extremity any attempt on the part of such power to coerce any state that had seceded from the old Union, proclaimed to the world that war should be waged against such states until they should be compelled to submit to their rule, and large forces to accomplish this have, by this same power, been called out, and are now being marshaled to carry out this inhuman design. And to longer submit to such rule, or remain in the old Union of the United States, would be disgraceful and ruinous to the state of Arkansas." End quote. There were also Confederate breakaway governments in Missouri and Kentucky, which issued secession ordinances as well. Missouri claimed that they were seceding in response to a federal invasion of their territory, and Kentucky more or less said the same thing. Lastly, the Arizona Territory claimed that they were seceding due to feeling abandoned and overlooked by the federal government because of a lack of federal help fighting the Indians, and the suspension of the Federal Postal Service. All of these documents are listed in the description for your perusal. Returning to what Sedgley said in this video, clearly not every state claimed they were seceding for slavery, even being charitable by excluding Arizona, Kentucky, and Missouri, and considering Virginia to have claimed that they were seceding for slavery, even though they didn't really say that. 5 out of the 11 states, nearly half of them, still did not claim that they were seceding to protect slavery, no matter how you attempt to interpret their secession documents. To be clear, I'm not taking issue with this overall point. Generally speaking, secession was triggered by the need to protect slavery, but not every state explicitly said that they were seceding to protect slavery, and in fact, some states actually were not. The way I would interpret it as follows. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded in response to Lincoln's election because they feared that slavery would be abolished, which would have ruined their economies. President Lincoln called for 75,000 men from the southern state militias to help reconquer the seceding states, which prompted Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to secede because they were unwilling to fight their fellow Southerners. This take is very similar to Sedgley's. But Sedgley has made an egregious and completely avoidable error by making a blanket statement. If he simply qualified his statement, saying most Confederate states seceded for slavery, he would have had a much stronger argument. But instead he says,
"The secession documents of every Southern state made clear, crystal clear, that they were leaving the Union in order to protect their peculiar institution of slavery,"
which is demonstrably false.
The vote to secede was 169-0 in South Carolina, 166-7 in Texas, 84-15 in Mississippi. In no Southern state was the vote close. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the Confederacy's vice president, clearly articulated the views of the South in March 1861. "Our new government," he said, "was founded on slavery. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, submission to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition."
I have no particular objections to this video bringing up the cornerstone speech. In fact, it's the only place in this entire video where Sedgley is both being honest and arguing effectively. However, I will take this opportunity to clarify my own take on the war, because it's at this juncture that people are probably going to get confused on what I believe. In the comment section of my original response to this video, people on both sides of the bell curve in terms of beliefs about the Civil War made a lot of assumptions regarding what I think about this conflict, largely because I never bothered to say what I actually thought. My position on the war is more nuanced than the revisionism you see on both sides, and probably deserves a video of its own. But here is a brief explanation. The initial 7 Confederate states seceded after the election of Abraham Lincoln because they felt the Republican Party was a threat to slavery, which was the foundation of the Southern economy. Lincoln decided to return these states to the Union by way of military force, and so 4 more states seceded and joined the Confederacy, on the grounds that they refused to fight states that they shared cultural, economic, and geographic ties with. The Lincoln administration then proceeded to invade, conquer, and annex the Confederate States of America. This is my primary point of disagreement with the traditional historical narrative. That being that I hold secession to be a right of any member of the United States of America, and thus that the Confederacy was a fully sovereign country. The idea that they were rebels is purely propaganda and revisionism. The idea that this conflict was a civil war, even though I still often call it that for the sake of simplicity, is, again, propaganda and revisionism. The actions of the Union are utterly indefensible, although the Confederacy was also pretty bad on account of their embrace of slavery. Hopefully you now understand my basic position. You will note that the Cornerstone speech doesn't contradict my point of view on the conflict at all, and I have no particular objections to this point.
Yet despite the evidence, many continue to argue that other factors superseded slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Some argue that the South only wanted to protect states' rights. But this raises an obvious question. The states' rights to what? Wasn't it to maintain and spread slavery? Moreover, states' rights was not an exclusive Southern issue. All the states, North and South, sought to protect their rights. Sometimes they petitioned the federal government. Sometimes they quarreled with each other. In fact, Mississippians complained that New York had too strong a concept of states' rights because it would not allow Delta planters to bring their slaves to Manhattan. The South was preoccupied with states' rights because it was preoccupied first and foremost with retaining slavery.
This is intentionally misleading framing of this issue and a poor example as well. While I don't hold to the states' rights narrative when it comes to the cause of the war, the Southern states did have a stronger concept of states' rights than the Northern states did. Thinking critically about this example, it's immediately obvious that one state cannot deprive a citizen of another state of their property. It seems rather distasteful to label another person as property, but from the perspective of those Southern planters, that's exactly how they saw it. And, like it or not, legally they were correct in those days. If, hypothetically, Indiana makes owning dogs illegal, and somebody from Illinois is driving through with their dog, want to be pulled over, and have their dog confiscated, they would be justifiably outraged. I'm not defending slavery, but it's unfair to judge people from this period through a modern cultural lens. As a brief aside, New York and other northern states which did this were also in violation of the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, so again, from a legal standpoint, the Southerners were actually correct. Circling back to the main point, this is an obviously cherry-picked example. The South always had, and to some extent even still does have, a stronger conception of states' rights than the North. That's a fact, and I'd even consider it common knowledge. Sedgley is being intentionally misleading on this point.
Some argue that the cause of the war was economic. The North was industrial and the South agrarian. And so, the two lived in such economically different societies that they could no longer stay together. Not true. In the middle of the 19th century, both North and South were agrarian societies. In fact, the North produced far more food crops than did the South. But Northern farmers had to pay their farmhands, who were free to come and go as they pleased, while Southern plantation owners exploited slaves over whom they had total control.
This is another example of dishonesty on Sedgley's part. Yes, the northern states produced a lot of food, and much of the population were farmers. This was true of almost everywhere on Earth in 1860. What really matters is relative industrialization, and on that front, the northern states were far more industrialized than the southern states. The Midwest was only just starting to industrialize, but the Northeast was totally reliant on manufacturing for their economy. The South was thoroughly agrarian and solely reliant on agriculture. Sedgley also implies that most Southerners owned slaves and ran plantations, which is of course nonsense. In fact, this actually contradicts the point he's trying to make, because most Southerners were poor and middle-class tradesmen and subsistence farmers, just like most Northerners. So under Sedgley's logic, the North and South were totally identical economically with no difference at all, with not only industry, but also slavery being completely irrelevant. Of course, we know that's not the case.
And it wasn't just plantation owners who supported slavery. The slave society was embraced by all classes in the South. The rich had multiple motivations for wanting to maintain slavery, but so did the poor, non-slaveholding whites. The peculiar institution ensured that they did not fall to the bottom rung of the social ladder. That's why another argument that the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery because so few people owned slaves has little merit.
Sedgley's point here is essentially true, but as always, there's more to it than that. Part of poor whites' support for maintaining slavery was status-based, but a much more important component was a fear of economic insecurity if slavery was abolished. Whether it was a realistic fear or not, there was a notion that freed slaves would take away all the jobs the tradesmen and unskilled workers relied on. This is an important point to bring up because what Sedgley is doing is dehumanizing the average poor white Southerner by portraying these people as only being worried about being better than black people, whereas in reality these were regular people trying to provide for their families who perceived a potential threat to their ability to put food on the table.
Finally, many have argued that President Abraham Lincoln fought the war to keep the Union together, not to end slavery. That was true at the outset of the war, but he did so with the clear knowledge that keeping the Union together meant either spreading slavery to all the states, an unacceptable solution, or vanquishing it altogether. In a famous campaign speech in 1858, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What was it that divided the country? It was slavery and only slavery. He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other." Lincoln's view never changed, and as the war progressed, the moral component, ending slavery, became more and more fixed in his mind. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law.
Remember the part where Sedgley said that slavery was the cause of the war for both sides? Here he is blatantly contradicting himself. The cause of a war doesn't evolve over the course of a conflict. If the United States didn't enter into hostilities for the purpose of abolishing slavery, then that's not what they were fighting for. Secondly, this quote from Lincoln in 1862 sure seems to portray someone to whom slavery was a secondary concern at best. Quote, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save this Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be errors, and I shall adopt new views so fast they shall appear to be true views." End quote. There was never a moral component at the start of the war. Lincoln began the war to preserve the Union, nothing more and nothing less. To even suggest that the Union was waging war for the purpose of ending slavery is completely ridiculous and has zero basis in reality. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure that was intended to cause slaves in the Confederacy to defect to the Union banner, while the slaves still in the Union, namely in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, were all exempt from the proclamation. It only applied to slaves inside the Confederacy. In other words, it only applied to slaves the Union had no power to actually free. Fascist Italy did the same thing during their conquest of Ethiopia in 1935. Does that mean that Mussolini fought a war to end slavery? No, obviously not.
Slavery is the great shame of America's history. No one denies that. But it's to America's everlasting credit that it fought the most devastating war in its history in order to abolish slavery. As a soldier, I am proud that the United States Army, my army, defeated the Confederates. In its finest hour, soldiers wearing this blue uniform, almost 200,000 of them former slaves themselves, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America.
The United States never fought a war to end slavery. It fought an illegal and immoral war to annex a recently independent country that they used to control, being motivated by nothing more than the basest tribal instincts. The actions of the United States of America during the War for Confederate Independence are completely indefensible, and there is absolutely no justification for their annexation of the Confederacy. It's to America's everlasting shame that they didn't allow the South to go free. As you have seen throughout this video, Ty Sedgley has repeatedly employed lies and half-truths intended to deceive and manipulate the audience into believing a false historical revisionist agenda which seeks to erase all nuance from its subject matter in favor of jingoistic nonsense. PragerU and Ty Sedgley have perpetrated this crime against history by knowingly lying through their teeth and just assuming their viewers were too stupid to fact-check them. Fortunately, they have been fact-checked, and the evidence for their deceit is overwhelming. Now you know the truth.